Welcome to week 2, where we will talk a little bit about how we think about ourselves. I have a little bit of feedback from the first activities that you did during week 1. I will go over briefly self-concept and the self-serving bias, and then I will review the activities that will be due for week 2. I do appreciate your patience while I play catch up a little bit after being gone this weekend. As far as announcements, I have graded most of the activities that you've completed. I will finish the rest of them by the end of this week. As far as activity feedback, your online posts were all excellent. You all did a great job. You composed them well, they were easy to read, and you integrated an aspect of the text. So each online post should have some reference to a concept from a reading in the textbook. The quiz 1 responses were also good. Some of the questions, as you know, were more opinion or preference questions, such as the classroom procedures, due dates, and times for activities. The chart to the right shows the number of votes for each of the times that you preferred. Sunday at midnight was the top preference, with Friday at midnight being the second top preference. If you decided that Friday at midnight was the best for you because you wouldn't have time over the weekend to work on things, of course you can always submit things early, so any of the other preferences could fall under Sunday at midnight. But I will have things be due Sunday at midnight on Scholar. You all did a great job with the multiple choice questions. As far as the short answer or essay questions, the only feedback I have for that is just to make sure that you're composing your responses in complete sentences to get full credit. And do check your spelling and grammar. Another hint is to read your responses aloud to yourself before you submit them to make sure that your sentences make sense. And as I mentioned, I'll have the feedback for the written reflections later this week. So to briefly review self-concept, it answers the question, who am I? So when you're thinking about yourself, how you think about yourself, you might think about yourself in terms of your personality characteristics. So you might say, I am intelligent. I am friendly. And the way that you think about yourself influences how you perceive the world around you. So if you think about yourself in a certain way, that will influence the kinds of things that you notice in the world. So if you think about yourself as athletic, you might notice things in the news that are about people who are athletic or about, let's say, the Olympics, and you'll also remember that better. And some of you mentioned being interested, or most interested, in how people interact with the world around them. So how the social interacts with the self. And one way this happens is the way that we think about ourselves in terms of our relationships with other people. So individualism and collectivism are two different ways of thinking about yourself. Individualism is represented by the 2 overlapping circles on the right side, where the self doesn't have a lot of overlap with others. So it could be other friends, family members, groups that you're affiliated with, whereas people who are more collective, who have collectivism, are represented by the 2 circles on the left, where there's more overlap. So you define yourself in terms of your relationship. So you might say, I am a sister, I am a nephew, I am a friend, instead of using those personality characteristics to describe yourself, which someone who is more individualistic would probably be more likely to do. Moving on to the self-serving bias. The self-serving bias generally represents a tendency to think about yourself favorably, and it answers the question, who's responsible? So if something good happens versus if something bad happens, the self-serving bias would determine who you think is responsible for that event. So if it's a positive event, then you would think that you are responsible. So if you do a good job on an exam, you would think, well, it's because I'm smart. It's because I studied really hard. Whereas if you failed an exam or if you got a poor grade on an exam, you might think to yourself, well, it's because the questions were too difficult, or the teacher just doesn't like me and so they graded my essay questions too harshly. And generally, the self-serving bias is applied to traits that are subjective and socially desirable. So there are some cultural differences, things that are socially desirable. Someone who is from a collectivist culture where social relationships are very important would tend to have that bias for traits that are relevant to social relationships. And this does apply to a number of different situations. So at work, most business people think that they are more ethical than the average business person. So this is something that is subjective, how ethical you are, and especially in a business scenario, being ethical is definitely socially desirable. And on the road, most drivers, even those who have been hospitalized because they got into an accident, think that they are safer and more skilled than the average driver. And also in the family, most adults believe that they support their aging parents more than their siblings do. There are also neighborhood differences. Specifically in Los Angeles, people who live in Los Angeles view themselves as healthier than most of their neighbors, and most college students think that they will outlive their actuarially predicted age of death by about 10 years. So an actuarially predicted age of death takes into account a lot of different factors that could influence your lifespan. So it could be whether or not you smoke, whether or not you exercise regularly, things like that. And just generally compared to others, people think of themselves as better. So specifically in the Netherlands, most high school students rate themselves as more honest, more persistent, more original, friendlier, and more reliable than the average high school student. So it is now week 2. You have kind of a sense of how this is going to go from week 1. As far as activities for week 2, first I would suggest reviewing the feedback from activities in week 1, so you can see specifically what feedback I gave. You can apply that to your work in week 2 and do even better. If you haven't already, read modules 3 and 4, and then take quiz 2 by Sunday at midnight, the deadline that you chose. Quiz 2 will cover modules 1 through 4. And as you might have seen from the syllabus, all of the quizzes and exams, all of the assessments will be cumulative. So you'll want to make sure that anything that you've studied before, you also review that as you're looking at new information. And this is the week that your group project topic will be due. So you just have to pick one group member to submit it on Scholar, and as I said, it will be due Sunday at midnight. So I gave you a little bit of feedback from the activities from week 1, briefly reviewed self-concept and the self-serving bias, and went over the activities that will be for week 2. And as always, if you have any questions about the activities or about any specific concepts, if something isn't clear, definitely just let me know, and I can respond to you via email.